What if the real reason your body refuses to lose weight is not your diet, not your exercise, but a single hidden hormone quietly controlling your fat storage system every minute of the day? When we talk about stubborn weight gain and metabolic resistance, one of the most powerful drivers is chronically elevated insulin. This is not just a blood sugar hormone. Insulin is the body's primary fat storage signal. And when it remains high for too long, it fundamentally shifts your metabolism into a storage-dominant state instead of a burning state. Under normal physiology, insulin rises after you eat, especially after consuming carbohydrates. Its job is to move glucose from the bloodstream into the cells for energy. Once the glucose is used, insulin should drop back down, allowing the body to switch into fat-burning mode. This cycle is essential for metabolic flexibility. However, in many individuals, this cycle becomes disrupted. Insulin stays elevated for long periods due to frequent eating, high refined carbohydrate intake, chronic stress, poor sleep, and insulin resistance. When insulin remains consistently high, the body receives a continuous signal that energy is abundant. In response, it shuts down fat breakdown. This process is known as inhibition of lipolysis. In simple terms, your body refuses to access stored fat because it believes there is no need to do so. Instead, it prioritizes storing incoming nutrients, even if they are excessive. At the cellular level, elevated insulin increases the activity of enzymes that promote fat synthesis, particularly in the liver and adipose tissue. This means more dietary glucose is converted into triglycerides and stored in fat cells. Over time, these fat cells expand, leading to weight gain, especially in the abdominal region, where visceral fat is more metabolically active and more dangerous for long-term health. Another critical effect of chronically high insulin is its impact on energy regulation. When insulin is elevated, it blocks the use of stored fat as fuel, forcing the body to rely heavily on glucose. This creates a cycle of dependency on frequent eating because blood sugar levels can drop quickly, leading to fatigue, cravings, and irritability. These symptoms are often misinterpreted as hunger, when in reality, they are signs of unstable blood sugar regulation. Insulin also directly interacts with other hormones that control appetite and metabolism. It interferes with leptin signaling, the hormone responsible for satiety and energy balance. When leptin signaling becomes impaired, the brain no longer accurately detects energy sufficiency. As a result, appetite increases even when the body has enough stored energy. Additionally, elevated insulin suppresses growth hormone and reduces the body's ability to repair and regenerate tissues efficiently. Growth hormone is important not only for muscle maintenance but also for fat metabolism. When insulin stays high, this hormonal balance shifts further away from fat burning and toward fat storage. One of the most overlooked consequences of chronically elevated insulin is its effect on mitochondrial function. Mitochondria are the energy-producing structures inside your cells. High insulin levels reduce mitochondrial efficiency, meaning your cells produce less energy from fat and become metabolically sluggish. This is often experienced as fatigue, brain fog, and reduced physical endurance. Over time, this state leads to insulin resistance. Cells become less responsive to insulin, forcing the pancreas to produce even more of it to achieve the same effect. This creates a vicious cycle. Higher insulin leads to more fat storage, more resistance, and even higher insulin output. This is the foundation of many metabolic disorders associated with weight gain. The key to reversing this process is not simply reducing calories, but restoring insulin sensitivity and allowing insulin levels to return to their natural rhythm. When insulin drops appropriately between meals, the body regains its ability to access stored fat, stabilize energy levels, and normalize appetite signaling. Understanding this hormone is essential because it explains why so many individuals struggle with weight loss despite significant effort. Until insulin regulation is addressed, the body remains biologically programmed to store fat rather than burn it. What if the real issue behind persistent weight gain is not how much glucose enters your body, but how poorly your cells are able to use it once it gets there? This is the core problem in insulin resistance, a condition where the body's cells become less responsive to insulin, leading to a cascade of metabolic dysfunction. To understand this clearly, you have to first understand insulin's normal role. Insulin is the hormone responsible for transporting glucose from the bloodstream into cells, where it is converted into energy. It acts like a key, unlocking the cell so glucose can enter and be used efficiently. In a healthy metabolic state, this process is smooth and tightly regulated. After eating, blood glucose rises, insulin is released, and glucose is quickly absorbed into muscle, liver, and other tissues for energy production or storage. Once blood sugar stabilizes, insulin levels drop, and the body transitions into a fat-burning state between meals. However, in insulin resistance, this system becomes impaired. The lock and key mechanism no longer functions efficiently. Cells in the muscle, liver, and fat tissue stop responding properly to insulin signals. As a result, glucose cannot enter the cells as effectively as before. This creates a paradoxical situation. There is plenty of sugar in the bloodstream, but the cells are effectively starving for usable energy. To compensate, the pancreas begins producing even more insulin in an attempt to force glucose into resistant cells. This leads to chronically elevated insulin levels, which is one of the most damaging metabolic states for fat regulation. High insulin not only fails to correct the underlying resistance, but also worsens it over time. When glucose uptake into cells is impaired, the body is forced to rely more heavily on circulating glucose rather than efficiently stored energy. This creates unstable energy patterns throughout the day. Individuals often experience fatigue shortly after eating, brain fog, and strong cravings for more carbohydrates. These symptoms are not simply dietary issues. They are direct consequences of cellular energy dysfunction. At the same time, because cells are not effectively using glucose, the body interprets this as an energy deficit at the cellular level. This triggers a survival response that encourages energy storage rather than energy expenditure. One of the primary outcomes is increased lipogenesis, the process by which excess glucose is converted into fat, particularly in the liver and adipose tissue. The liver plays a central role in this process. When it is overloaded with glucose that cannot be efficiently used or stored as glycogen, it converts the excess into triglycerides. These triglycerides are then transported and deposited in fat cells throughout the body. Over time, this leads to increased visceral fat accumulation, which is strongly associated with metabolic syndrome and cardiovascular risk. Insulin resistance also disrupts normal fat-burning mechanisms. Under healthy conditions, the body alternates between using glucose and fat as fuel depending on energy availability. However, when insulin levels remain elevated due to resistance, fat oxidation is suppressed. The body becomes metabolically locked into a glucose-dependent state even when fat stores are abundant. This creates a critical imbalance: high circulating glucose, high insulin levels, and increasing fat storage, all while cellular energy production remains inefficient. This is why individuals with insulin resistance often gain weight despite not overeating significantly. The problem is not just calorie intake, it is metabolic miscommunication at the cellular level. Another important consequence of insulin resistance is mitochondrial dysfunction. Mitochondria are responsible for converting nutrients into usable energy in the form of ATP. When insulin signaling is impaired, mitochondrial efficiency decreases, reducing overall energy output. This contributes to chronic fatigue, reduced physical endurance, and slower metabolic rate. Inflammation also plays a major role in worsening insulin resistance. Elevated glucose levels can trigger inflammatory pathways that further impair insulin receptor function. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle where inflammation worsens insulin resistance and insulin resistance increases metabolic stress. Over time, this condition progresses if not addressed. The pancreas continues to overproduce insulin, the cells become increasingly resistant, and fat accumulation accelerates. This is why early intervention is critical. Restoring insulin sensitivity allows glucose to once again enter cells efficiently, reducing the need for excessive insulin production and reactivating normal fat metabolism. Improving insulin sensitivity involves restoring cellular responsiveness through metabolic balance, stable blood sugar regulation, and reducing chronic hormonal stress on the system. When this happens, the body can finally shift away from constant glucose dependency and return to a more flexible, efficient energy state where both glucose and stored fat can be used appropriately for fuel. What if the real driver of stubborn belly fat is not what you eat, but how your body responds to chronic internal stress at the hormonal level? One of the most powerful and often overlooked metabolic disruptors in weight regulation is elevated cortisol. Cortisol is the body's primary stress hormone, produced by the adrenal glands. Under normal conditions, cortisol follows a natural rhythm, rising in the morning to help you wake up and gradually declining throughout the day. This rhythm is essential for stable energy production, glucose regulation, and overall metabolic balance. However, when stress becomes chronic, whether from poor sleep, emotional strain, overtraining, blood sugar instability, or excessive caffeine intake, cortisol remains elevated for prolonged periods. This sustained elevation creates a cascade of metabolic changes that significantly interfere with fat loss and promote fat storage, particularly in the abdominal region. At the physiological level, cortisol's primary role is to ensure survival during perceived stress. It does this by increasing glucose availability in the bloodstream. It stimulates gluconeogenesis in the liver, a process where non-carbohydrate sources like amino acids are converted into glucose. While this is beneficial in short-term stress situations, chronic activation leads to consistently elevated blood sugar levels. When blood sugar remains elevated due to persistent cortisol activity, the pancreas responds by releasing more insulin. This creates a hormonal overlap where both cortisol and insulin remain high simultaneously. This combination is particularly problematic because it strongly promotes fat storage while inhibiting fat breakdown. Cortisol also has a direct effect on fat distribution. It increases the activity of lipoprotein lipase, an enzyme that encourages fat deposition, especially in visceral fat cells located around the abdominal organs. This is why chronic stress is closely associated with central obesity, even in individuals who may not consume excessive calories. At the same time, elevated cortisol promotes the breakdown of muscle tissue for energy. This process, known as proteolysis, reduces lean muscle mass over time. Since muscle tissue is metabolically active and plays a major role in maintaining basal metabolic rate, its loss further slows down overall energy expenditure. This creates a metabolic environment that favors fat accumulation and reduces the body's ability to burn calories efficiently. Another critical effect of chronic cortisol elevation is its impact on insulin sensitivity. High cortisol levels interfere with insulin receptor function, making it more difficult for cells to respond properly to insulin. This leads to insulin resistance, which further amplifies fat storage and disrupts glucose metabolism. The combination of cortisol-induced insulin resistance creates a persistent state of metabolic imbalance. Cortisol also affects appetite regulation through its interaction with the hypothalamus. Elevated cortisol levels increase cravings for high-calorie, carbohydrate-rich foods. This is not a psychological weakness, but a biological response designed to quickly restore energy during stress. However, in a modern environment where stress is constant but physical activity is often low, this mechanism leads to excessive caloric intake and further metabolic disruption. In addition, cortisol negatively impacts thyroid hormone conversion. The body converts inactive thyroid hormone, T4, into its active form, T3, primarily in the liver. Chronic stress impairs this conversion process, leading to reduced thyroid activity at the cellular level. This slows down metabolic rate, decreases thermogenesis, and reduces the body's ability to burn fat efficiently. Mitochondrial function is also affected by prolonged cortisol elevation. Mitochondria are responsible for producing ATP, the energy currency of the body. Chronic stress hormones reduce mitochondrial efficiency, leading to lower energy output and increased fatigue. This often results in reduced physical activity levels, further compounding weight gain. Another important aspect is the disruption of sleep quality. Elevated cortisol, especially at night, interferes with melatonin production. Poor sleep quality then feeds back into the system, increasing next-day cortisol levels and further impairing metabolic regulation. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle of stress, poor sleep, hormonal imbalance, and weight gain. Over time, the combination of these effects creates a highly unfavorable metabolic environment. The body is simultaneously breaking down muscle, storing fat, resisting insulin, reducing thyroid activity, and increasing appetite. This multi-hormonal disruption explains why chronic stress is one of the most significant barriers to sustainable weight loss. Restoring balance requires addressing the underlying stress response system. When cortisol levels return to a healthy circadian rhythm, insulin sensitivity improves, thyroid function normalizes, and fat metabolism becomes more efficient. The body can then shift out of survival mode and back into a state where energy is properly utilized rather than stored. Understanding cortisol's role is essential because it connects emotional and physiological stress directly to metabolic outcomes. Without correcting this hormonal imbalance, traditional weight loss approaches often produce limited or temporary results. What if your body is producing enough energy signals to tell your brain you are full, but your brain simply cannot hear them anymore? This is the core problem in leptin resistance, a metabolic condition that plays a major role in persistent overeating, weight gain, and failure to lose body fat despite adequate effort. Leptin is a hormone produced primarily by adipose, fat, tissue. Its main function is to communicate energy status to the hypothalamus in the brain. In a healthy system, leptin acts as a long-term regulator of appetite and metabolism, signaling when the body has sufficient energy stored and when food intake should decrease. When fat stores increase, leptin levels naturally rise. This should send a clear signal to the brain that energy reserves are adequate, reducing hunger and increasing energy expenditure. Conversely, when fat stores decrease, leptin levels fall, triggering increased appetite and reduced metabolic rate to preserve energy balance. This feedback loop is essential for maintaining stable body weight. However, in leptin resistance, this signaling system becomes impaired. Although leptin levels in the bloodstream are often elevated, especially in individuals with higher body fat, the hypothalamus no longer responds appropriately. The brain behaves as if the body is in a state of starvation, even when energy stores are abundant. This miscommunication leads to persistent hunger, reduced satiety, and increased food-seeking behavior. At the neurological level, leptin resistance primarily affects the hypothalamic nuclei responsible for appetite regulation, particularly the arcuate nucleus. This area integrates hormonal signals related to hunger and energy expenditure. When leptin signaling is disrupted, the balance between orexigenic neurons, which stimulate appetite, and anorexigenic neurons, which suppress it, becomes skewed toward increased food intake. As a result, neuropeptides that promote hunger, such as neuropeptide Y and a Agouti-related peptide, become more active. At the same time, appetite-suppressing signals decrease. This shift creates a strong physiological drive to consume more calories, particularly energy-dense foods rich in sugar and refined carbohydrates. Leptin resistance is closely linked with chronic inflammation. Inflammatory cytokines interfere with leptin transport across the blood-brain barrier, reducing its ability to reach hypothalamic receptors. Even when leptin is present in sufficient quantities in the bloodstream, it cannot effectively communicate with the brain. This creates a functional deficiency at the central nervous system level. Insulin resistance further compounds this problem. Elevated insulin levels promote leptin resistance by disrupting intracellular signaling pathways in hypothalamic neurons. This creates a dual hormonal dysfunction where both glucose regulation and appetite regulation are impaired simultaneously. The combination of insulin and leptin resistance is a key driver of metabolic syndrome and progressive weight gain. Another important factor is the role of triglycerides in leptin signaling. Elevated circulating triglycerides can impair leptin transport into the brain. This is commonly seen in diets high in refined carbohydrates and unhealthy fats. As triglyceride levels rise, leptin signaling efficiency decreases, further weakening satiety responses. Sleep deprivation also plays a significant role in worsening leptin resistance. Inadequate sleep reduces leptin production while simultaneously increasing ghrelin, the hormone that stimulates hunger. This hormonal imbalance leads to increased appetite, reduced satiety, and a preference for high-calorie foods. Over time, chronic sleep disruption contributes to sustained leptin dysregulation and metabolic dysfunction. Leptin resistance also affects energy expenditure. When the brain interprets leptin signaling as insufficient, it reduces metabolic rate to conserve energy. This includes decreased thermogenesis, reduced physical activity, and lower basal metabolic rate. The body effectively shifts into an energy-conserving mode, making weight loss significantly more difficult even with caloric restriction. At the cellular level, mitochondrial function is indirectly influenced by leptin signaling. Impaired leptin communication reduces the body's ability to efficiently oxidize fatty acids for energy. This metabolic shift further encourages fat storage and reduces fat utilization. Over time, leptin resistance creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Increased fat storage raises leptin levels, but the brain becomes progressively less responsive. Hunger signals remain elevated, food intake increases, and fat accumulation continues. This cycle is one of the most important underlying mechanisms in long-term obesity development. Restoring leptin sensitivity requires addressing the root causes of hormonal disruption, including inflammation, insulin resistance, poor sleep quality, and excessive intake of processed carbohydrates. When leptin signaling is normalized, the hypothalamus regains its ability to accurately interpret energy status, allowing appetite and metabolism to return to a balanced state. What if your body is eating normally, your calories are controlled, but your internal engine is simply running too slow to burn fuel efficiently? This is one of the most overlooked causes of stubborn weight gain and fatigue. Low thyroid hormone activity, particularly reduced levels of active triiodothyronine, or T3. The thyroid gland, located in the lower front of the neck, functions as the master regulator of metabolic rate. It produces primarily thyroxine, T4, which must be converted into T3 in peripheral tissues such as the liver and kidneys. T3 is the biologically active form that directly influences how fast or slow nearly every cell in the body functions. When thyroid hormone levels are optimal, the body maintains a healthy basal metabolic rate. This means cells efficiently convert oxygen and nutrients into energy, heat production is normal, fat oxidation is active, and energy levels are stable throughout the day. However, when thyroid hormone production or conversion becomes impaired, metabolic processes slow down significantly. Low thyroid function, often referred to as hypothyroid activity, reduces the rate at which mitochondria produce ATP, the primary energy currency of the body. This directly impacts energy availability at the cellular level. As a result, individuals often experience fatigue, low motivation, cold intolerance, and difficulty sustaining physical activity. These symptoms reflect a systemic slowdown in energy metabolism. One of the key metabolic consequences of reduced thyroid hormone activity is a decrease in basal metabolic rate. This means the body requires fewer calories to maintain basic physiological functions such as breathing, circulation, and temperature regulation. While this may sound efficient, in reality it leads to energy imbalance when calorie intake remains unchanged. Excess energy is more likely to be stored as fat rather than burned. Thyroid hormone also plays a direct role in lipid metabolism. It increases the activity of enzymes involved in fat breakdown, particularly hormone-sensitive lipase. When thyroid levels are low, fat mobilization from adipose tissue becomes impaired. This leads to increased fat accumulation, especially in areas like the abdomen, hips, and thighs. In addition, thyroid hormone influences carbohydrate metabolism. It regulates glucose absorption in the intestines and glucose utilization in cells. When thyroid function is reduced, glucose metabolism slows, contributing to higher blood lipid levels and increased risk of insulin resistance. This metabolic slowdown often creates a cascade effect involving multiple hormonal systems. Protein metabolism is also affected. Thyroid hormone supports protein synthesis and tissue repair. In a low thyroid state, protein turnover decreases, which can contribute to muscle weakness and reduced lean body mass over time. Since muscle tissue is metabolically active, its reduction further decreases overall energy expenditure. A critical aspect of thyroid dysfunction is its interaction with liver metabolism. The liver is responsible for converting T4 into the active T3 hormone. When liver function is impaired due to fatty liver, insulin resistance, or nutrient deficiencies, this conversion process becomes less efficient. As a result, individuals may have normal T4 levels, but still exhibit symptoms of low thyroid activity due to insufficient T3 availability. Nutrient deficiencies also play a significant role in thyroid hormone production and conversion. Iodine is essential for thyroid hormone synthesis, while selenium is required for the conversion of T4 to T3. Zinc and iron also contribute to proper thyroid enzyme function. Deficiencies in any of these nutrients can impair thyroid efficiency and slow metabolic rate. Chronic stress further compounds thyroid dysfunction. Elevated cortisol levels can inhibit the conversion of T4 to T3 and increase the production of reverse T3, an inactive form of thyroid hormone that blocks receptor activity. This creates a functional hypothyroid state even when hormone levels appear within normal laboratory ranges. Thyroid hormone also influences cardiovascular function by regulating heart rate and cardiac output. In low thyroid states, heart rate often slows and circulation becomes less efficient. This contributes to feelings of coldness, reduced stamina, and slower recovery after physical exertion. Another important effect is on thermogenesis, the process of heat production in the body. Thyroid hormone stimulates mitochondrial uncoupling proteins that generate heat from energy expenditure. When thyroid activity is reduced, thermogenesis declines, leading to lower body temperature and reduced calorie burning. Over time, low thyroid function creates a multi-system metabolic slowdown. Energy production decreases, fat storage increases, digestion slows, and physical performance declines. This combination makes weight loss significantly more difficult even when diet and exercise are consistent. Restoring thyroid function involves addressing the underlying causes of hormonal imbalance, including nutrient deficiencies, liver metabolism efficiency, stress regulation, and insulin balance. When thyroid hormone activity returns to optimal levels, metabolic rate improves, fat oxidation increases, and overall energy production becomes more efficient. Understanding the role of thyroid hormone is essential because it acts as a central regulator of metabolic speed. When it slows down, every system in the body follows, creating a global reduction in energy output and a significant barrier to healthy weight management. What if the real reason your body refuses to lose fat is not one hormone alone, but a complete breakdown in how multiple hormonal systems communicate with each other? This is the reality of metabolic dysfunction, a disrupted balance between insulin, cortisol, and thyroid hormones that creates a biological fat storage mode in the body. When these three systems are not working in harmony, metabolism becomes inefficient, energy production slows, and fat accumulation becomes the dominant physiological outcome. Under normal conditions, these hormones work together in a tightly regulated network. Insulin manages blood glucose and nutrient storage, cortisol regulates stress response and energy mobilization, and thyroid hormones control overall metabolic rate and energy expenditure. When balanced, this system allows the body to efficiently switch between burning glucose and burning fat depending on energy demand. However, when this hormonal network becomes dysregulated, the body loses metabolic flexibility. Instead of smoothly adapting between energy states, it becomes locked into a survival-oriented pattern that prioritizes fat storage over fat burning. The first disruption often begins with insulin. Chronically elevated insulin, usually driven by frequent carbohydrate intake, insulin resistance, or poor metabolic health, signals the body that energy is constantly available. This suppresses fat breakdown and promotes triglyceride storage in adipose tissue and the liver. Over time, cells become less responsive to insulin, forcing the pancreas to produce even more of it, further reinforcing fat storage pathways. At the same time, elevated insulin directly interferes with thyroid hormone activity. It impairs the conversion of T4 into the active T3 hormone, reducing metabolic rate at the cellular level. This means even if thyroid hormone levels appear normal in blood tests, the body may still function in a low-energy state due to poor hormone activation. Cortisol adds another layer of complexity. When stress becomes chronic, whether physical, emotional, or metabolic, cortisol remains elevated for prolonged periods. This hormone increases blood glucose by stimulating liver gluconeogenesis, ensuring a constant supply of energy for perceived survival needs. However, in a modern environment where stress is persistent but physical exertion is limited, this leads to sustained high glucose levels and further insulin release. The combination of high cortisol and high insulin creates a particularly harmful metabolic state. Cortisol promotes fat storage in the abdominal region, while insulin prevents fat breakdown. Together, they create a strong physiological drive toward visceral fat accumulation, which is metabolically active and closely associated with inflammation and insulin resistance. Cortisol also suppresses thyroid function by reducing the conversion of T4 to T3 and increasing the production of reverse T3, an inactive form of thyroid hormone. This reduces overall metabolic rate and contributes to fatigue, cold intolerance, and decreased energy expenditure. In this state, the body conserves energy rather than burning it, further promoting weight gain. When thyroid function is reduced, the entire system slows down. Mitochondrial energy production decreases, basal metabolic rate drops, and fat oxidation becomes inefficient. This makes it harder for the body to utilize stored fat even when calorie intake is reduced. Instead, energy is conserved and fat remains stored as a protective mechanism. The interaction between these three hormones also affects appetite regulation. Insulin resistance disrupts satiety signaling, cortisol increases cravings for high-energy foods, and low thyroid function reduces overall energy availability, leading to fatigue-driven eating patterns. This combination often results in overeating without conscious awareness of increased intake. Inflammation further worsens this hormonal imbalance. Elevated insulin and cortisol promote inflammatory pathways, while low thyroid activity reduces the body's ability to repair and regulate immune responses. Chronic inflammation then feeds back into insulin resistance, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of metabolic dysfunction. At the cellular level, mitochondria become less efficient under these hormonal conditions. Energy production shifts away from fat oxidation toward less efficient glucose-dependent pathways. This reduces endurance, increases fatigue, and lowers overall physical activity levels, which further decreases caloric expenditure. Over time, this hormonal triad creates a deeply entrenched metabolic state where fat storage is prioritized, energy output is minimized, and appetite regulation is impaired. Even with dietary restriction or exercise, the body resists fat loss because it perceives the environment as one of ongoing stress and energy uncertainty. Restoring balance requires addressing all three systems simultaneously. Improving insulin sensitivity, normalizing cortisol rhythms, and supporting thyroid hormone conversion are all essential for restoring metabolic flexibility. When these systems return to equilibrium, the body can once again shift between energy states efficiently, allowing stored fat to be accessed and used for fuel.